party to mark the end of a semester. It should have been an evening full of celebration. But no one knew that when Brandon Swanson left the party that night, it would be the last time he was ever seen alive. What happened that night, and will the mystery ever be solved? This is The Truth Inside, the unsolved case of Brandon Swanson. Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode from The Truth Inside. Today I'm covering another unsolved disappearance, the disappearance of Brandon Victor Swanson. Following a night out, during a phone call with his parents, he cries out in alarm and is never seen from again. Was it a tragic accident, or was foul play involved? Or, as quoted by the police, did Brandon just have a right to disappear? As this is The Truth Inside, I want to explore the facts that surround Brandon's case. But, as with all unsolved cases, there are gaps in the story, gaps that we don't have the facts for. Where that's the case, I will be asking questions, but I'll make it clear the answer is unknown and that any opinions shared are my own. And, as with all unsolved cases, any people mentioned are innocent until proven otherwise in a court of law. I'll have all of my sources linked should you wish to go away and do your own research. Let's begin. The Who. Throughout this deep dive, we'll be talking about three key players. The first, of course, is Brandon. The rest of the Swanson family is made up of his parents Brian and Annette. Brandon also has a sister, Jermaine, although she doesn't really feature in the story regarding Brandon's disappearance. To provide some background, Brandon was born in Marshall, Minnesota on the 30th of January 1989, which made him 19 years old at the time of his disappearance in 2008. He was 5'6" with brown hair and blue eyes, and due to a childhood injury he wore glasses. He was legally blind in his left eye. He graduated from Marshall High School in 2007. He then went on to study wind turbines at Minnesota West Community and Technical College in another city in Minnesota, 𝗥𝗲𝗀𝗲. By all accounts he was happy and enjoyed a close relationship with his family. The when and the where. The early hours of the 14th of May 2008, Marshall, Minnesota. The city of Marshall is in Lyon County, Minnesota, in the southwest. In 1993, 95 and 2002, it was selected as one of the best small towns in America, largely due to it being a leader in industry, education and technology. It's also a beautiful location with lots of open space, a factor that has made the search for Brandon all the more difficult. The what? May the 13th, 2008 was a Tuesday, and classes at the Minnesota West Community and Technical College had ended. As is usual, students were hosting parties to celebrate the end of a semester. Brandon was invited to one such party, hosted in Lind, a small town approximately 7 miles from his home in Marshall. At some point in the evening, Brandon decided to leave this party and head to another being held in 𝗥𝗲𝗀𝗲, about 40 minutes drive away. According to a source, he'd gone to say goodbye to a friend, although this hasn't been widely documented. Brandon arrived safe and sound and continued enjoying the night with friends. Now, friends stated that whilst Brandon had drunk some alcohol, perhaps a beer and a shot of whiskey, from what they could see, he was not intoxicated. The last confirmed sighting of Brandon was actually at this party. After enjoying himself at the party, at approximately midnight, Brandon decided it was time to head home. This would have been an approximate 35-minute drive, on roads that Brandon would have been very familiar with, having made the trip on numerous occasions between his home and college. And the route itself was a pretty straightforward drive too, one road heading southwest on the highway. Whilst this should have been, and would have ordinarily been, an uneventful journey, Brian and Annette received a call that no parent wants. It was from Brandon saying he had been involved in an accident. Whilst travelling home, Brandon had driven his Chevy Lumina into a small ditch. Fortunately, despite Brian and Annette's initial reaction, Brandon was uninjured, but the car was firmly stuck. Brandon asked to be picked up and gave directions. He thought he was near the town of Lind, where he'd been earlier on in the night. The time was 1:45 a.m. Brian and Annette drove to the area Brandon told them, but were unable to see him. They honked their horns, flashed their lights, asking if Brandon could hear or see anything. Negative to both. It appeared that Brandon had given the wrong directions, although he was confident he hadn't. If he got the car stuck where they thought he had, where the highway dips into a shallow ditch, they would have been able to see him, and the terrain around the area should just be flat. At this point, frustrated, Brandon said he would walk towards the lights he could see. It's assumed these were the lights in the town of Lind, where he had been earlier on in the night. He asked his parents to pick him up there. As Brandon walked, he remained on the phone narrating his journey. His mother said in an interview that, as long as Brandon was on the phone and talking, it was okay. During the phone call, Brandon explained that he was walking along a gravel road, and then through fields and over fences, complaining, "Not another fence." He also talked of hearing water running nearby. But still he continued, the lights of Lind, or what he thought were Lind, as his North Star. It was when the call came to an abrupt end that Annette began to worry. At round 3 a.m, Brandon cried out an expletive in alarm, "Oh shit," before everything went silent. Despite calling out to Brandon over the phone, there was no answer. Annette and Brian hung up before trying to call back. Nothing. Their calls were never answered. Worried about what had happened to their son, Brian, Annette, and now some of Brandon's friends began canvassing Lind, walking up and down the streets, trying to establish if Brandon was wandering the streets lost. Hours went by. Brandon never surfaced. At 6:30 a.m, Annette called the Lind Police Department to report her son missing. It was now the 14th of May. The police were initially hesitant to support the search. A 19-year-old boy goes missing after a few drinks at a college party. It's not compelling, with one officer saying that he had the right to be missing. However, there was the ominous "oh shit" before Brian and Annette could no longer get hold of Brandon. That was certainly enough cause for concern, that and the time that had passed since they had last spoken to their son. Eventually, after about 12 hours since Brandon was last seen, authorities opened a missing persons case and started the search. When local Lind police couldn't find Brandon or his car, reinforcements were called. The county sheriff's office were able to search for Brandon's phone records to identify where he actually was when he was on the phone to his mum and dad. This is where the tale becomes even more mysterious. According to the phone records, Brandon wasn't even in Lind, not even close. He was some 25 miles from Lind in a small town called Taunton. It was here that his car was found on a side street, a gravel access road really, the car undamaged. County Sheriff 𝗥𝗲𝘀𝗀𝗀 said, "It was off the side of a field approach and the vehicle was hung up. It's a sort of sharp incline, nothing major but enough that the car would get hung up so the wheels are too high off the ground to get any traction." So, to be clear, earlier when I said Brandon drove his vehicle into a ditch, it's worth me clarifying. This insinuates that Brandon lost control and crashed the vehicle. However, given the road he was driving on was more a gravel road and it was muddy, it's more likely that the car slipped or skidded and wound up in a position where the wheels wouldn't get good traction. In an interview, Brandon's mother Annette also confirmed this by saying that when the vehicle was found there was no damage, it was just a little muddy. Equally, no beer or blood was found in the car and nothing to indicate that Brandon was impaired in any way. When the vehicle was searched for clues, police found no signs of foul play, but one thing of significance that the police found was Brandon's glasses. As we know from earlier, Brandon was blind in one eye and couldn't see properly without them, so the fact he didn't have his glasses with him just added to the already growing amount of concern. Why didn't he take his glasses with him? A ground search began and helicopters were deployed to look for Brandon from the air. Bloodhound dogs were also brought in to follow Brandon's scent. The dogs followed a trail through fields and towards an abandoned farm. Whilst everyone thought that's where the trail would likely stop, they continued past, following a trail along Yellow Medicine River before stopping at the embankment. The water was about knee-high, so 15 feet approximately. Could he have drowned? Teams were deployed to search the river with this theory in mind, but nothing was ever recovered. The local sheriff didn't believe he drowned either. He walked up and down the river every day for 30 days. No body and no evidence was ever found. Everyone anticipated that had he drowned and been washed downstream, his remains would have been recovered. It does seem likely that Brandon was in the vicinity of the river though. He mentioned running water whilst on the phone to Brian and Annette, and the dogs had followed along the river for a period of time. Annette said, however, that one of the dogs crossed the river and started towards a trail along the other side. So they believe that whilst he may have entered the water, they don't believe he came to any harm at this point. Searches continued. The days turned to weeks, turned to months, turned to years, and as of 2022, no one has seen or heard from Brandon. His phone, wallet, car keys, clothing, nothing has ever been found. It was always felt by his parents and the community that had authorities begun searching sooner, there might have been a more favourable outcome. So, in 2009, Brandon's Law was passed. This law requires Minnesota police to begin immediate searches for missing adults under 21, as well as adults who disappear under suspicious or unusual circumstances. Now, over the course of time, there have been a number of possible theories as to what happened. Of course, these are just theories, but I'll explain some of the facts that might help to prove or disprove some of these. Before I do that though, there are some elements of this story that I need to highlight. The time between Brandon leaving the party and calling his parents. It's said that Brandon left the party in 𝗣𝗲𝗀𝗀 around midnight. The journey home should have only taken approximately 35 to 40 minutes. If Brandon was driving a little more cautiously, given he consumed some alcohol, but not enough to intoxicate him as detailed by his friends, then you could add a little bit more time onto this, but not enough to account for nearly 2 hours between leaving and then calling his parents. We then need to consider that Brandon's vehicle was actually found near Taunton, only 15 minutes from his original destination. Why such a large passage of time? What did Brandon do before leaving? Is there a sinister explanation, or is it a simple case of he got his car stuck and then panicked for quite some time, trying to free the vehicle, trying to tell his friends, and then mulling over whether he should or shouldn't call his parents? And why did he think he was near Lind? Now, there's been much speculation over the amount of alcohol Brandon consumed that night, and if that played some part in his confusion that day. Some people would argue that his friends may have been attempting to cover for him by saying he wasn't drunk, but Brian and Annette both testify that Brandon seemed very sure of himself on the phone. Coherent, certainly not slurring his words and sounding disorientated. So if he wasn't drunk, then what? Well, honestly, we don't know, not for certain. It seems likely that he just got confused. It's possible he was avoiding the highway because he knew he'd had a shot of whiskey, and despite knowing the area, all of the roads looked the same. And we need to remember that it was late at night and it was dark. He was likely fatigued, and it's easy to switch off during a familiar drive. There's also the possibility that if he was on the phone or distracted in any way, he could have taken a wrong turn or missed a turn off. If he recognised that and had tried to navigate back, time could have easily passed by. It's obvious that Brandon clearly thought that due to the passage of time he had travelled almost all of the way home, 30 minutes plus, hence why he thought he was near Lind, and that's possible. He could have been driving for this length of time and therefore made an educated guess as to where he was. It is still unusual, nonetheless. The curse word. How Brandon said the expletive can lend a lot of context. For example, when I've tripped over or stubbed my toe, I might exclaim this, but it's clear I'm fine, it's just an instant reaction. However, if I've seen something I shouldn't, then I might say this differently, with shock, with disbelief. Brandon could have said this phrase in numerous different ways depending on what he saw, heard or felt. Unfortunately, it's never been clear from Brian, Brandon's father, quite how he did say this, and over the passage of time, memories can fade and change. This would have really helped to understand what might have been going on at that moment in time. So now we've covered a couple of the more confusing elements that make up this case, we'll cover the theories that have been suggested over time. Theory number 1, Brandon disappeared voluntarily. Of course, in the absence of a body, the idea that Brandon may have chosen to disappear and is now living somewhere else under another name can never be fully ruled out. However, given the fact that Brandon called his friends and then parents for help, it certainly works against this theory. If you were planning to take off, it's highly unlikely you'd call your parents and ask to be picked up. Even if you did plan to send them on a wild goose chase, the fact that Brandon said a curse word and then didn't answer his phone would certainly cause alarm bells. You'd actually be encouraging people to look for you, and sooner than if you'd just taken off quietly. Annette certainly doesn't believe Brandon staged his own disappearance. She doesn't believe he could do such a thing, and there was no indication that there was anything wrong in his life that may have caused him to want to do that, including any previous history of mental illness. Theory number 2, Brandon was killed either accidentally or intentionally. This feels highly unlikely and has largely been discounted. The roads Brandon were on were quiet and rural. The likelihood of an offender being on the same road at the same time as Brandon is low. At the time of Brandon's disappearance, Taunton only had a population of 135 people. The chance that someone just happened to see Brandon, given the small population size, is incredibly slim. Also, given the fact that Brandon was on the phone to his parents as he walked, would have meant that someone would have had to have been following him, perhaps for some period of time. Of course, there is the idea that Brandon, who was walking across numerous fields at the time, could have been shot and killed by a farmer. It's not out of the realms of possibility that a landowner could have thought that someone was up to no good and trespassing on their land. Maybe Brandon shouted a curse word because he saw someone pointing a gun. But Brian and Annette have said that once he said this, there was silence. No sound of talking, no sound of other people, a shot being fired, just quiet. Theory number 3, Brandon drowned. This is certainly one of the more popular theories, despite Brandon's body never being discovered. We know that bloodhounds traced Brandon's scent to the river, and this combined with the fact it was late at night and Brandon didn't have his glasses on, it's probable that this could be the case. If his body got caught downstream and dragged or held under the water, it could be hard to spot, and of course over time decomposition will play its role. If the river was involved in some way, it's more likely he entered the water but climbed out the other side and continued on his journey. At least that's what the scent trail seemed to confirm. Given it was under 40 degrees Fahrenheit that night, he could have easily succumbed to the elements, although you would have to question what happened to his body and why it was never recovered. Some would say that because of the fields he likely found himself in, with the growing crops reaching quite a substantial height and being dense, it could have prevented his body being found. Later on, when these crops were harvested, his body could have been caught in farm equipment. Theory number 4, Brandon fell into a well or cesspit. Wells can be commonly found in rural areas, especially those around farms and agricultural land. It's possible that whilst Brandon was on the phone to his parents, he slipped, and in doing so he exclaimed, "Oh shit," before dropping the phone, which would explain why the phone kept ringing and going to voicemail when Brian and Annette tried to call back. It's also possible that this could account for why the dogs could not locate Brandon. Wells, pits, etc. can go deep into the ground, and if filled with water, the scent could have been obscured. Equally, they can be poorly documented, meaning any types of searches are difficult. So what happened to Brandon? The fact he vanished without a trace is baffling. There's no physical evidence at all. His mobile phone, clothing, nothing. If you have any thoughts, I'd love to hear them. But, for the sake of his friends and family, hopefully one day the truth inside this mysterious case will emerge. Brandon Swanson has brown hair and blue eyes, stands 5'6", and weighs 125 pounds. When last seen, he was wearing blue jeans, a white or black hat twisted to the side, and a white short-sleeved t-shirt. Anyone with information that could lead to the whereabouts of Brandon Swanson is asked to call the Lincoln County Sheriff at 507-694-1664. If you have any information relevant to the case, please see descriptions for ways in which you can share this. Thank you for joining me as we discuss the truth inside true crime, mysteries and legends from around the world. As terrifying or as uncomfortable as the truth may be, as Theodore Roosevelt once said, in the end, the most unpleasant truth is a safer companion than a pleasant falsehood. Until next time.